Good evening, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. My name is Olivia, and I'm an AmeriCorps member with Conservation Nebraska's Common Ground program. This program aims to improve stewardship of Nebraska's natural resources by increasing knowledge and concern for some of the most important conservation issues facing our state. So to make this happen, our focus is on providing volunteer opportunities, engaging community members, and continually improving local conservation practices and providing educational opportunities like this webinar that we're all in right now. So today is Groundhog Day, but it's also World Wetlands Day. And so this day marks the adoption of the Convention of Wetlands on February 2nd, 1971. The goal of establishing this event was kind of to raise global awareness about the vital role that wetlands play for people and our planet, especially here in Nebraska, given our unique wetland makeup. So tonight we have with us Ted LaGrange and Grace Gaard from Nebraska Game and Parks. So Grace has worked as the Aquatic Ecology Education Specialist at Game and Parks Commission for a little over a year. Her work in aquatic education includes the coordination for Trout in the Classroom program for educators across the state, as well as numerous water-related projects that seek to educate Nebraskans of all ages about unique natural resources. Prior to this, she spent 5 years as a naturalist at Fontenelle Forest in Bellevue, Nebraska. Grace has a bachelor's in fisheries and wildlife from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and is currently working on her master's. Ted has worked as the wetland program manager for the Nebraska Game and Parks Commission for about 27 years now. As the wetland program manager, he works on a variety of wetland issues throughout Nebraska, including partnerships, private land restoration programs, public lands management, research, regulations, and outreach. So pretty much jack of all trades. Prior to moving to Nebraska, he worked for 8 years as a waterfowl research technician for the Iowa Department of Natural Resources. Ted received his bachelor's and master's in wildlife biology from Iowa State University. His professional interests are in prairie wetlands and waterfowl/bird ecology. Before I hand it over to Grace and Ted, I just want to remind all participants that mics are muted and that we cannot see you. While we will have a few poll questions pop up throughout our presentation, there will be a designated Q&A time. The chat function, however, will remain open. So if you do have any questions along the way, feel free to use the chat feature. We will also have an optional exit survey at the end of our event tonight. This not only helps us get feedback for future events, but it also serves as a way for participants to be entered into our giveaway for some free swag from Conservation Nebraska and Game and Parks. So I will hand it over to Grace and we can get started.
Yeah, thanks, Olivia. And thanks to everyone for joining us today to talk about wetlands. And we're excited to celebrate World Wetlands Day and especially focus in on Lincoln's wetlands as well. So kind of how our presentation is going to flow is I'm going to tell you a little bit about, general things about wetlands and kind of what they are. And then Ted's going to dive in deeper into what kind of the saline wetlands are around Nebraska, especially around Lincoln. And then I'll wrap us up by talking about some of the cool things you can do when you visit wetlands. So we'll get us going real quick. I just had a picture of Ted in the field. He's got lots of experience, so I'm sure he'll be able to answer a lot of your questions. And I did a kayaking canoeing program when I was at Fontenelle a lot. So I really grew to love and have a connection to wetlands and think they're just so amazing and a great place to spend your time. So, and energy as well. So what is a wetland is a huge question. And it seems kind of obvious. It's land that is probably wet, but a more technical definition might be an area that is saturated or full of surface water or groundwater. And sometimes those actually are connected as well. Probably a lot of the time they're connected. So this water that exists in wetlands is there often enough and or for long enough that it can support specific plant communities adapted to soggy soils, which are typically what you will find in a wetland. And so wetlands can include things like swamps, marshes, bogs. A lot of times similar areas are going to be, on the edges between maybe a river and a lake. There's just a lot of different places that wetlands kind of pop up. And some of them can even be man-made if you're in a more urban area. So wetlands are kind of made up of three key pieces. So that's what I'm going to walk you through here. So one of the first key pieces of a wetland is the soil. So there's some really great photos you'll see along the way here in this presentation that come from Platte Basin Time Lapse. These are just two of the amazing photographers that work with them. And so we've got some really great photos here just of some different kind of the different kinds of soil you might see when you're visiting a wetland. Sometimes when it dries out, it looks a little more cracked like that bottom photo. And then obviously that top photo, you've got a lot of water kind of saturated into that soil. So the first thing about the wetland soils is that they are hydric, which sounds like a fancy word, but hydric just means that it's full of water. So these soils are going to be generally full of water. As well, these soils typically develop in areas underwater with little to no oxygen. So if you don't, it's been a while since you've learned about the kind of the food web and how decomposers work to create a soil. They break down dead and dying things and turn it into soil. And so this soil is actually, this occurs underwater where there's little oxygen. So it just develops a little bit differently than your typical earthy soils. And so it will actually be different colors, like it might be gray or black. And it generally has a smell that smells more like eggs, rotten eggs maybe. And then they contain a lot of organic matter. So a lot of those things that maybe don't survive, plants, animals, break down into smaller pieces and kind of make up the wetland soil. So soil is that first piece of what makes wetlands a wetland. The next thing about what forms a wetland is their plant community. So these are going to be specific species that are adapted to live and regenerate or reproduce in anaerobic conditions. And anaerobic just means places with low to little oxygen. So they can survive in those soils like we were just talking about. So there's some photos here. The classic wetland plant that probably all of us have seen is the cattails on that left image. And they are, I've worked with students a lot in wetlands, and we always say it looks like a kind of like a corn dog or a hot dog on a stick. So those are your cattails, and they grow pretty well, partially kind of submerged in the water. That middle photo, you've got kind of like American lotus, I believe is this photo, and they have roots that kind of descend down. So they're more of like a floating plant on top of the water. And so some of these algae I don't have a photo of, but things like algae also don't quite even have true root systems, but they can survive in lots of wetland types that maybe even have hardly any oxygen in them. So it just kind of depends. And then that far right photo is a type of smartweed, I believe, and those are more submergent. They can grow kind of with their roots are submerged underwater. And a lot of these plants are able to kind of reproduce by like almost cloning their roots and spreading out that way. So they're pretty fascinating. And then the third piece, we talked about soil and plant community. The third piece of what makes wetlands a wetland is kind of the hydrology, which basically just means the water, which seems self-explanatory, but these wetlands are saturated, especially during spring and summer. So in our main growing seasons, they are very likely to have water. However, the big thing to remember about wetlands is that they are not always wet. You can kind of see from some of these photos down here. You've got the right photo with the more brown colors, and the white is, I think, more of an alkali wetland. And so a lot of times when those waters evaporate, they leave behind a crust of like salts. And then you've got a playa wetland there on the left side. And that's, it's not necessarily a big body of water. It's water just underneath the soil. So it doesn't always look like it is wet, but it generally is just beneath the surface or returns often throughout the season. So those are the three things that kind of make up wetlands. So what do wetlands do, and what are some things that some things that they can do that make them especially important for us and for our ecosystem. So the first thing is that they actually are like a sponge. They will absorb water. So if you go back and you remember that soils image with the cracked soil, that's kind of like, you imagine a sponge has lots of air holes in it that when you put it in water, that water makes its way into all of those pores and saturates the sponge. So similar with wetland soils, they have kind of lots of air pockets in them and are able to saturate as well when we have, say, like big rain events or melting events like Nebraska has seen before. Sometimes too much water has melted, you know, so for even a wetland to soak it up. But they are very good at this, and they're so important for things like flood management. And you have to, if you've never heard of ecosystem services, it's basically the ecosystem around us can provide humans with services that actually, you know, equate to dollar amounts. So wetlands are a huge service that actually can have a decent amount of money technically assigned to its effectiveness at protecting our resources and human things like our houses or you know, our cities and things. So wetlands provide us an ecosystem service, which is really cool. They also clean contaminated water. And this isn't something that's just like a snap of the fingers and it's clean, but they are able to filter things out as water that's contaminated maybe runs off in big rains or from the street. Oil from cars, you know, runs down through a storm drain. That water does go somewhere, and it usually goes to a wetland. And so while we of course want to cut down on as much of that contamination as we can, wetlands have a unique ability to kind of filter a lot of these toxic things out. Some plants can even kind of withhold them, to like kind of take them out of the water and hold them in the plant body too. So that's a pretty cool, unique thing. And then just another thing, wetlands do a lot more things than this, but they provide food to humans and animals as an ecosystem. So not just fish. Fish are obviously a piece of wetlands that can be food, but things like berries, like if you enjoy cranberries or, you know, other human foods, they do, a lot of them come from wetlands. And then of course, animals, it's basically like their grocery store. And that's why we have a lot of migrators, especially birds, stop through there because it's a place that's full of food for them to eat. So that is just a few things. A couple more that I have is one of them acts as the perfect safe haven for many species to raise their young. So when we're doing this lesson with kids, we like to show them like a cradle and compare that, you know, like a metaphor. A wetland is a safe place for lots of animals to have their babies. And you can see there's a tern there in that photo. With a tiny baby, you can kind of barely see it. It's well camouflaged into that sand. Another thing is their habitat for threatened and endangered species. And if you're watching and you're from Lincoln, you probably have heard of the Salt Creek tiger beetle. So that's what's in that image there. And it is it's a very unique endangered species that is very centralized in the saline wetlands. So Ted will talk about that more later, but wetlands are definitely a very diverse type of habitat full of life, and especially usually threatened species can be found in wetlands. And then they give us many recreational opportunities. So I loved kayaking, so we threw that in there, but there's lots of other opportunities for recreation in wetlands, and we'll talk about that more a little bit farther into our presentation. So real quick, I'm going to talk too about the different types of wetlands in Nebraska. Now, urban isn't technically one that we include, so I'm going to eliminate that one from the possibilities, but we did have a poll question. I'm not sure if our hosts have that. There we go. So how many categories of wetlands are there in Nebraska? So you can go ahead and just take a guess. Definitely doesn't matter if you're right or wrong, but it's always kind of fun to just interact and take a guess on How many categories of wetlands do you think there are in Nebraska? I'll probably give you like 10, 15 more seconds. Get your answer in. Be interesting to see what we all think. All right. Are we able to show our results or share them? Okay. Nice. So we had a majority of you say 5. So you were correct if you said 5, although 3 was kind of close. So I'm going to run us through the main types of wetlands that we do have in Nebraska. And it gets tricky. I think Ted actually says to categorize them more as categories of wetlands. And so I'll try to make sure I keep that in mind. But yeah, urban is not necessarily included in these, but it is a very important one. Like we were just saying, wetlands provide an ecosystem service to us. This is a picture, I believe, of the saline wetlands. You know, they are very urban, really close to the city of Lincoln. And they're a really great place to still connect to nature. And again, provide us with those ecosystem services. So if you get the chance to ever, if you live in an urban area, explore one of your wetlands, I highly recommend it because they're probably closer than you think. Let's see here. There we go. Our next wetland category, it's kind of 2 categories. So we have the sandhills wetlands, which are unique. They're formed, you know, between the depressions of the different rolling sandhills, which are found in western Nebraska and kind of northern Nebraska. You can find a lot of groundwater coming from the Ogallala Aquifer, and then also from rain and snow events and things like that. So, but usually the wetlands kind of form between these different rolling sandhills. Sandhills is an incredible place if you have not got a chance to see it before. And then kind of grouped in there is what we call the alkali category of wetlands. And so there's kind of like salts that form, but the pH of alkali wetlands is obviously higher than 7. So they're more of a basic type of salt. And so these types of wetlands are typically found in or around the sandhill wetlands as well. So when they dry up, they'll have kind of that crusty formation of salt left behind by the evaporation, and all the salts that are in the soil kind of making their way out. So those are 2. Then we've got riverine wetlands. This is an amazing photograph. I love to see the riverine wetlands from above, because you don't just have the river. If you look closer, you can see down at the bottom plant communities kind of growing in more soggy areas where water does divert from the river. And so riverine, they are all over Nebraska, because Nebraska does have a lot of rivers: the Platte River, Missouri River, the Loops, Niobrara, many more that I'm not saying. So these unique wetlands are all over the state, but they do kind of differ depending on where they are within the state. And then playa wetlands, which are kind of, if you think historically in Nebraska, we had prairie, and these were kind of wind-blown depressions that then fill with water or connected to the groundwater, and a lot of agriculture surrounds these playa wetlands. So they are found kind of in the center of the state. And then saline. So saline wetlands are obviously the ones we're kind of diving further into today, and Ted's gonna talk more about that. But obviously they do have kind of salt in them, right? So let's see, Ted, I will stop sharing if you would like to share here.
Okay. Olivia, did you want to, are there any questions that to address before I get started?
There haven't been any pop up in the chat yet. But
Okay.
if anyone along the way has a question, feel free to throw it in the chat and we can address it as they pop up.
All right. Well, welcome. Again, happy World Wetlands Day. So I'm Ted LaGrange, a Wetland Program Manager for Nebraska Game and Parks. And I'm going to focus in on, Grace kind of gave you the overview of what wetlands are and where they're at throughout the state, but I'm going to focus in on the saline wetlands located in and around Lincoln. So what I'm going to cover in the next 20 minutes or so is just where we find them, some of the functions that Grace has already shared with you, but we'll talk about the functions that these saline wetlands can provide, cover parts of the history, both the early history up to current history in and around Lincoln, the alterations to these wetlands that have occurred, the benefits that again have been mentioned, and then we'll wrap up my portion talking about the conservation initiatives that have been undertaken to protect this unique wetland resource. So Grace talked about a number of wetland types we have throughout Nebraska. Nebraska is a state blessed with a huge variety of different types of wetlands. What I'm going to focus on for my presentation is this area in southeastern Nebraska, in Lancaster and southern Saunders County in this green color. This is where our eastern saline wetlands are. So that's what I'm going to spend my time talking about. And so if we zoom in a little bit more and look at Lincoln and some of the surrounding towns, this green boundary is that boundary I showed on the statewide map, and the purple boundary is where our what we define in our natural legacy plan is a biologically unique landscape, kind of focused in on where those saline wetlands and associated streams are located. And if I highlight in white here where the saline wetlands and saline soils are located, that shows you that distribution of salty areas. And so that's shown here in the white. You can see they are very tied to the streams of Salt Creek and the adjacent tributaries to Salt Creek. And so this is an aerial photo of one of those tributaries to Salt Creek. This is Rock Creek up by the town of Ceresco in southern Saunders. Actually, you're seeing both Saunders and Lancaster counties here. And so you can see these are saline wetlands associated with the stream. You can see they're very tied to these, what we call alluvial valleys, these valleys that the streams reside in. And I'll talk about why that is in just a moment as we talk about their formation. So these are areas, has been noted, they get a salty crust, and this particular salt crust is just basically, it's got some other elements in, but is mostly common table salt. So if you were to lick the surface of this wetland or pick up some of the crystal material, it would just taste like table salt, like you use in our cooking and to season our foods. So that's what occurs and makes these very unique type of wetland. Obviously, we associate salty areas with the oceans and those marine environments, but it's very unusual to find interior saline wetlands located a long ways away from any ocean. So where did this salt come from? And this is a great diagram. It's a little complicated for this, but so I won't go into a lot of detail. This is was an article in Nebraska Land Magazine. Tim Reichert was the artist who worked on this, did a fantastic job. Shows a cross section of a saline wetland. And you can look at that. It's an article by Mike Forsberg called Success in the Salt Marsh. But this shows that basically the salts are coming from underground. So we've got some salty water underground in these rock formations. It's under pressure. So if you put a well down, you will actually get free flowing water up that well, what is called an artesian flow. So that water works its way. If you can see my cursor here, the mouse arrow, it works its way up through these alluvial materials, which are sands and clays and silts and even little bits of gravel. And eventually it finds its way to the surface. And when that happens, you get these little salt crusts forming and you get a saline wetland that forms. So where does this water come from and where do the salts come from? And this is obviously not near Lincoln, and it's obviously not a saline wetland. This is a stream coming out of the Rocky Mountains, but the water is actually recharged that comes across the plains, is recharged at the Front Range of the Rocky Mountains. So when we talk about a connected ecosystem, we think about that with flowing surface waters like the Platte River, but underground, there's also a connectivity, and those underground waters are connected. And so there's recharge in of the groundwater that occurs on the Front Range of the Rockies. And again, won't get into a lot of detail on this cross section of the geology, but this is the town showing kind of where Denver is. And and the Rocky Mountains. And so those waters move across the plains, across Kansas and parts of Nebraska, and they hit a barrier when they get near Lincoln, get under pressure, and they come to the surface, like I talked about, that upward artesian flow. And they pick up the salts in some of these materials, these shales and other rocks, formations that were laid down when this area was covered by ocean millions of years ago. So there are salty layers down in the bedrock. The water picks up those salts and brings it to the surface. And that's how we end up with salt saline wetlands here in Lincoln. So a very fascinating story on how that all comes together. So this is a close-up of those salts. It's, again, a crust, just common table salt. And I'll talk about how it was important economically, how it was harvested and mined and led to the formation of the city of Lincoln. But first, it has a long history, of course, prior to the establishment of the city of Lincoln. The Native American populations that inhabited lived on the plains, including in Nebraska, recognized these saline wetlands as very important. Not only did they attract game species that they used for food, but salt was also an important commodity, an important product for them to use in preserving their foods. And so the saline wetlands are noted in that part of history. And this is a really neat quote, I think, from the Lewis and Clark expedition. Lewis and Clark, of course, came up the Missouri River in the early 1800s. They actually sent an expedition up the Platte River, and they came to the mouth of Salt Creek that they called, what I have underlined here is it says, a river comes into the Platte called Salt River. The water is so brackish or salty that it can't be drank at some seasons. And so really neat observation from the Lewis and Clark expedition that they came up, they recognized Salt Creek as being brackish or saline at that point. And so kind of a fascinating observation from the early 1800s. I like this quote. I won't read the whole thing, but this is from an early settler in Lincoln. He's describing coming to where Lincoln now is in 1861. And so he talks about the beautiful landscape, the beautiful view, a drove of antelope. And so we don't think of pronghorn antelope being in eastern Nebraska, but they did occur here historically. And then coming upon a beautiful view of these tall sunflowers. And he also talks about the salt basins reminded us of morning breezes at the ocean beach. And so that was W.W. Cox recounting his visit in the mid 1800s. So Lincoln got established as a community, and people started to settle there, mainly attracted to the saline wetlands. So this is a photo of an early sod house in the Lincoln area, mid 1800s. And it was established as a salt extraction or mining community. So they took hundreds of thousands of pounds of salt a year out of the saline wetlands in and around Lincoln in the 1860s, 70s, and up through the 90s. And so pretty fascinating history. Most people don't understand or realize that the city of Lincoln was founded as a salt extraction location. It probably wouldn't be here, at least as a big city and as our capital and home to our university, if it hadn't been for these saline wetlands and the salt industry that attracted people here. Now, the salt industry collapsed because large underground sources of salt were found that were much more economical to mine. And so the salt industry collapsed, but the city of Lincoln persisted and grew. Another thing, people think of J. Sterling Morton, of course, Nebraska being home to Arbor Day, and J. Sterling Morton in Nebraska City played a prominent role in that. But he also, in his family, founded Morton Salt. So we think of Morton Salt as being obviously an important product, important company that sells salt. Well, it got its start in and around Lincoln, Nebraska, in our saline wetlands. Love this photo. This was taken in 1902 west of Lincoln, probably out towards the Yankee Hill Brickyard area, and looking or out towards Pioneers Park, but looking back towards the city of Lincoln. You can see a couple smokestacks. That's the city of Lincoln. And it's fascinating because this is Salt Creek. If you're familiar with Salt Creek now, it's fairly deeply in size, kind of flows in this deep channel and has large berms along the edge. Much different stream back in the early part of the 1900s. Another part of the history people don't realize is that the saline wetlands, especially Burlington Beach or the Saline Lake, now called Capitol Beach Lake, was actually an extremely important recreational site. It was kind of the worlds of fun, adventures of fun, or oceans of fun, Adventureland type of amusement park back in the early and mid part of the 1900s. There was actually a spur of the Burlington Northern Railroad that took people there, and they rode roller coasters and went on boat rides and sat in the mineral springs, and it was quite a place to hang out, apparently. And that all also eventually collapsed and went away. And we know what Capitol Beach is now developed into a place where people live and have homes. So we kind of turned our back on the saline wetlands and Salt Creek, and in the 40s and 50s, flooding was a problem in Lincoln from Salt Creek. In addition, Salt Creek had to carry the city's wastewater away. And so projects were put in place to basically develop it as we know it now, which is a straightened and ditched stream, carries the water away fast, and also has a series of levees along it that help protect from flooding. So a highly altered stream. And when they did that, not intentionally, but when they altered Salt Creek the way they did, it had huge implications and alterations to the saline wetlands. So they straightened the stream, so it cut away from a lot of the marshes and took it away from interacting much with the floodplain. The photo on the upper right is Randy Studheit, a wetland biologist for Game and Parks, standing in Little Salt Creek, highly incised or a deep canyon-like cut. And you talk to farmers who remember that area from the 1950s, they talk about being able to drive a tractor and wagon across Little Salt Creek. Obviously, you couldn't do that today. It's changed greatly. And what that causes is the bottom photo shows some head cutting, or these erosive gullies that come up and actually drain away the wetlands. So a whole bunch of things have altered those wetlands. In addition, the city, after it was established as a salt extraction community, continued to grow. So this is the Burlington Northern Hobson Yard on the west side of the city. That rail yard was built over a lot of different wetlands, and the city continued to grow. This is a buffer. This is an area right around a saline wetland up by Superior Street. We were doing an evaluation project of the watershed of that wetland. You can see not a very healthy watershed if you're talking wildlife habitat. It's an apartment complex and a parking lot and a mowed yard. And so a lot of alterations have happened to these wetlands over the years. This also shows that well. This is a aerial photo from the one on the left is from 1955. So it's before the interstate was built. And then on the right shows a more contemporary photo showing North 27th Street and Interstate 80. And you can see how greatly altered that landscape was as this road network came in. As an interchange opened up with 27th Street and Interstate 80, it opened that area up for a lot of development. And so you can see a lot of salty crust on these wetlands here. This was 27th Street. On this particular map from 1955, it's noted that these parallel lines are the future route of Interstate 80. So they'd already had it plotted out on this aerial photo. But so a lot of changes and alterations happened when the city continued to grow. In addition, not only are impacts from things like the alterations from the growth of the city, but we have invasive species like reed canary grass and hybrid cattail that we historically did not have to deal with. So the saline wetlands have been highly altered over the years and are considered highly threatened. That said, there's a lot of good news too. There are some amazing saline wetlands left. These photos show some of those salt flat areas on some saline wetlands, and this lime green on the left is saltwort or pickleweed, which is a state endangered plant. And on the left, that blue-green plant is called sea blight. And actually, if you bite into the leaves of either of these, they taste extremely salty. They're a succulent with a thick leaf and are well adapted to growing in these desiccating conditions that saline wetlands have. Grace mentioned the Salt Creek tiger beetle. It's a highly endangered insect, one of the rarest animals in the world. This is a photo again taken Ethan Freeze with Platte Basin time lapse, amazing photo of a Salt Creek tiger beetle. There's populations of several hundred, maybe about 300 of these left. They only live in the saline wetlands and streams right around Lincoln. They're found nowhere else in the world. So something that is very unique to Lincoln and our surrounding wetlands. In addition, we have a number of species that are listed as at risk, or what we call tier 1 and 2 in our natural legacy plan, which is the blueprint for conservation of species in Nebraska, including the 2 endangered species, the Salt Creek tiger beetle. And as I mentioned, this saltwort or pickleweed is a state endangered plant. And so the only place it's found in Nebraska is on the saline wetlands right around Lincoln. In addition, when we talk the plant community, there's a number of other types of plants that are found in the saline wetlands. I'm not going to have time to go into all of them. This is the upper left is salt marsh aster, a pretty plant that blooms in the fall. We also upper right is kind of a saline meadow area that's cut for hay. When we talk about food production, hay and livestock are an important product that comes off of wetland areas. The slide on the lower left is foxtail barley. Really pretty photo there, Mike Forsberg took. And then we have some standard marshy areas like the one on the bottom right, your more classic marshes that are part of the saline wetland complex. So in addition, we have a number of species of wildlife. So they're well noted for birds, especially shorebirds and waterfowl. And here we're showing the upper left is a northern shoveler, upper right are Wilson's phalaropes, a type of shorebird. And then here we got the combination in the middle of ducks and a couple of types of shorebirds. I think I'll go out on a limb here. There might be some good birders in the audience. I think this is a pectoral sandpiper and this is a lesser yellowlegs, but I could easily be challenged on that. So, these areas are very important for birds and they get a lot of use by birders and posts from like the Community Science eBird project. But in addition, and these photos are just fantastic, there's a lot of other species that use these wetlands, from muskrats to damselflies and deer, and we have sedge wrens. This is a nose of a snapping turtle in one of the wetlands, and of course a bald eagle, and they nest around some of the wetlands in North Lincoln. So amazing area. Again, credit Mike Forsberg here. Mike did the project Success in the Salt Marsh for us, and allows us to use his photos and some amazing work there. Finally, these wetlands are important not only for the wildlife they provide, but for a variety of other services. Grace mentioned these ecological services. So everything from green space, a place to take a hike and enjoy nature. Some of our areas further out from town are open to public hunting and provide that source of recreation. And in addition, as Grace mentioned, they're important for flood control. This is a picture I took of one of the saline wetlands at North 27th and I-80 after a heavy rain event, the one I think in 2015 that nearly flooded the city of Lincoln. And so a lot of water being held there that if it wasn't in those wetlands would have gone right downstream and impacted Lincoln even worse. So let's talk, as I wrap up, about the conservation efforts. And I always talk about we stand on the shoulders of those who came before us. There's a lot of amazing conservation work done, from Frank Shoemaker back in the early 1900s, catching tiger beetles on a salt flat and cataloging them for the university. A lot of work done in the 80s and 90s of some of my predecessors and people I still work with. Jerry Steinauer, my predecessor, Dick Gersib, heavily involved along with a lot of different agencies on identifying these wetlands and categorizing where they're at and dealing with their importance. And when I came here in 1993, it was mostly a regulatory battle. It was seemed like it was going to be a battle to the end of which wetlands could be developed and which ones we might be able to conserve. Wetlands being filled for development. The photo on the bottom right is one I took recently, but this Home Depot at Cornhusker and 27th Street. This was a Kmart, the Home Depot at the time I came to Lincoln, and it had just been built over a degraded saline wetland. So there were saline wetlands located right along Cornhusker and 27th Street. And North 27th Street, as you went north of Cornhusker, there was almost no development when I came here in 1993. You can just the amount of development there now is incredible. The amount of businesses and housing and things that have been developed up that corridor. That's all had an effect on saline wetlands. I give the city a huge amount of credit. The city of Lincoln recognized the importance of saline wetlands in a variety of different natural habitats and threatened and endangered species in the early 2000s, and put together a green print challenge to help conserve these areas. And their comprehensive plan, including the current one, recognizes the importance of saline wetlands and tries to direct growth in a way that allows for the city to continue to grow, but it helps conserve wetlands and other unique habitats. So a great job by the city to be proactive about that conservation and to help guide it into the future. And then there's a saline wetland conservation partnership that the city and others helped establish back in the early 2000s, 2003, I believe. The upper right is a group of us, including myself. I was involved with the formation of this group that worked on that along with the city, the Lancaster County, the Lower Platte South Natural Resource District, and the Nature Conservancy. And we have a new plan and a new updated team. A few of us are still holdovers. The bottom left there shows Tom Malmstrom, who's our saline wetland coordinator, Dan Schultz with the NRD, Kelsey Wehrman with Pheasants Forever, myself, and then Nicole Fleck-Toos with the city of Lincoln. So that's the partnership that works to guide conservation of these wetland areas. And some amazing successes. This map is from that Success in the Salt Marsh article, shows some areas that have been conserved along Rock Creek and Little Salt Creek and Salt Creek. And so the areas in green here have been protected since the establishment of the Saline Wetland Conservation Partnership. And so just closing, this is some projects we worked on at Jackson Wildlife Management Area up by Ceresco, again along Rock Creek, a pre-restoration, and then after a lot of restoration work done with funds from a variety of different partners, including the Nebraska Environmental Trust, been able to do some amazing work. So you can imagine if you're a wildlife species that likes wetlands or a service being provided by wetlands, the one on the right, the restored areas, are going to provide tremendous, tremendous benefit. There's a lot we're still learning. And so we're still doing work on directing conservation and trying to learn about these wetlands that will help guide us and guide our conservation efforts into the future. And that wraps up my portion on the saline wetlands around Lincoln, but stay on because Grace is going to come on and finish up. And as a little teaser, we're also going to have a Wetlands of Nebraska video trailer that we're going to show at the end. So I'll stop share here.
It looks like we have a couple of questions really quick.
Yeah.
So it looks like Jill asked, is any salt still extracted in Lincoln?
No, not commercially that I'm aware of. So.
And Phyllis had two questions. She asked, how can spongy wetland be the base for the rail yard or buildings? And then her other question was the hay that you had mentioned earlier, is that salty?
Okay, the first one, development, yes, you can't build right on, although the saline soils have a lot of clay in them, they're not super boggy, but when they fill those areas, they bring in soil from surrounding uplands usually that has a high clay content and build on top of that. So that's what allows them to build onto wetlands. And then the hay might have a little salt in it. Some of those species, like I mentioned, saltwort and sea blight, have a lot of salt. And so if they cut hay and you had some of those in that hay, certainly it could be salty. And livestock love salt, so they probably are attracted to that. So.
It looks like Leanne asked, what can we as community members do to help? She lives close to the wetlands in North Lincoln and wants to do her part.
Yeah, I just learn about the wetlands, and Grace is going to talk here and just about some things to do in the wetlands, but learn about them, advocate for them as you're willing. For planning, again, the City of Lincoln, support the Saline Wetland Conservation Partnership. Organizations we work with, there's a number of private conservation organizations that help with wetland conservation and provide funding, supporting the Environmental Trust and encouraging them to fund things like saline wetland projects. It'd be great.
And then Leanne asked again, does the NRD help provide guidance for grasses and et cetera that will thrive in this area?
We can help landowner, yeah, the NRD or any of us could help with like planting recommendations.
Kelly asked, in addition to promoting restoration of the saline wetlands, what is being done to increase numbers of tide beetles, if anything?
Yeah, I didn't have time to get into that, but there's a major restoration effort, captive breeding effort, working with the zoos, the Lincoln Children's Zoo, Henry Dorley Zoo in Omaha, and I believe the Topeka Zoo in Kansas are heavily involved with a captive rearing effort. They can grow them in captivity and then release them back into the wild. And so that's something that's been happening for probably 8 years or so, 7 or 8 years, and is one of the measures that's being taken along with protecting property and trying to restore things better.
Elise asked, how long and to what degree are these saline wetlands typically saturated, and what is the process of restoration and how long?
They as Grace mentioned, they dry up periodically. Some places have this regional groundwater discharge and stay pretty wet year round, dry up almost every year during drier times like August, July, August, September. And then restoration involves fixing what's wrong with that area. So everything from taking some sediment out that's maybe washed in from an urban development to fixing the drainages that have been put in place to try to drain an area, removing that fill. We've got a neat project, again, don't have time to get into up at an area. I think Grace will highlight it as an area to visit, the marsh wren wildlife area. We're actually pumping some saline water, bringing it up to the surface, running it out across the surface to help restore saline wetlands.
Sonia asked, what can we do as landowners of wetlands in protected areas? Or
yeah, just
do?
I mean, it's great if you're a landowner protecting that wetland. A lot of what landowners do can protect those wetland areas. We encourage some degree of grazing and haying. Some of those types of activities can be actually quite compatible with the wetland. And we certainly can offer just our advice to landowners. We have private lands programs, but also technical assistance we can provide if they have particular questions. So we appreciate the good work that those private landowners are doing.
And then Lori asked, is there a difference between a restored wetland and a constructed wetland? I've always understood created wetlands to replace destroyed wetlands don't offer the same services and are failures.
Yeah, we have some areas constructed wetlands or created wetlands, maybe in a place where there never was a wetland. Some of those do amazingly well and can be almost natural-like, but I don't think they ever fully replace a natural wetland in its proper landscape setting. And so restoration would be trying to work with an area that has the soils and the landscape setting that had wetlands in it previously, and you're trying to bring those wetlands back, as opposed to a creation or construction where maybe you're putting a wetland in an upland setting that never was wetland.
And then Steve asked, how do you stop the cattails?
Let me know. It's a tough one. The hybrid cattail are very aggressive. We do a variety of things from livestock grazing to some herbicide use. You hate to use a lot of herbicide, but sometimes for invasive species, we will do some of that. Mechanical harvest and just altering maybe how we restore and how we deal with water levels can help. But it's a big problem that we don't have it all figured out yet.
Cameron asked, what is causing the block on the aquifers coming out of Colorado that forces the water up along the salt?
We're not sure. I mean, there's some speculation from the geologists about something. Obviously, it's a barrier of some type that keeps that water from just flowing on east, but I've never had it very well explained to me what that might be. So good question.
And then Denise asked, is there a list of wetlands to visit and directions to get there?
Perfect segue for Grace, who's going to close up with talking about that. So did you plant that question, Grace?
I did not, but it's perfect. But before you go on, Eugenia has asked twice. On your map, you showed green areas are saved wetlands, and then they're wondering what the pink areas
Oh,
are.
sorry. Yeah. So the pink ones were just areas that are conserved, but were done prior to the partnership coming into existence. So the partnership came into existence in 2000. So we had some areas, and the NRD did in the city, that were conserved, like wildlife areas and things prior to 2003. So that's what that color difference is. Did you have anything to add to any of those things, Grace?
No, I think you answered everything perfectly.
Okay. Well,
So
you ready to-
I can go ahead then and share my screen and kind of go quickly. You'll have to bear with me because I think it's going to make me go through the whole presentation and catch up. Yeah, hold on. Of course. I apologize. I thought there used to be something where you could like start slideshow from this slide, but I can't seem to find it.
I think there is, but this is a good overview.
Yeah.
Good review for people.
Remind you all.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, I'm almost there. Okay. All right, so I'm just going to talk to you all real quick about visiting wetlands, and Ted, feel free to jump in as I get to places to visit and things.
Okay.
But celebrating wetlands is what we're all excited about, and why we wanted to have this presentation today. And so one of the big things that would be recommended is that when you're getting ready to possibly go to a wetland is to familiarize yourself with some of the leave no trace principles. And if you have never heard of Leave No Trace before, it's just a really great organization that teaches people how to enjoy and recreate in the outdoors responsibly. So recreating responsibly is just a really great way to get involved in the outdoors, but then also make sure that we're taking care of it as we enjoy it. So planning ahead and preparing is great when you're visiting a wetland. Probably not a great idea to wear your brand new white shoes, and making sure you're traveling more on the durable surfaces. Obviously disposing of all waste properly. So making sure you go in with a plan to pack out what you pack in, leaving what you find there. So a lot of people don't know this, but things like feathers and from specific bird species are actually protected, and you're not really supposed to take them home with you. So just trying to respect nature and leave what you find there. Minimizing campfire impacts if there is a campground you visit that's in a wetland. Obviously fire actually can be a really great tool, and also something that when certain, I would say, wetland plants are really dried out, could be a hazard. So just be responsible with that. And obviously respecting wildlife. There's tons of wildlife in wetlands. I love to visit them because there is such a great chance of seeing an actual wild animal, all the way from owls to mink to beavers. So many cool things to see there. So just giving it its space and respecting that it's enjoying its home, and then being considerate of other people who are visiting wetlands. So recreation in wetlands can look kind of different for different people. So we have one more poll question that's just, what is your favorite way to enjoy a wetland? We'll see if that pops up here. So you can just, I'll give you about 15 seconds again. What is your favorite form of recreation? If it's not up there, you could feel free to share it in the chat if you want to, because I didn't have photography and some other ones that are kind of missing from there. So feel free to add it in there. All right, 5 more seconds. All right, you can go ahead and show us our results, see what people are interested in. Awesome. Kayaking's pretty high. Hiking is our highest. Not too many hunters today. Birding is obviously definitely a big one. And then other, so we'll have to check out the chat if you want to see what other things people like doing in wetlands. But this is a beautiful photo. I just had to include it. This is from canoeing in the wetlands at Fontenelle Forest. And so they did this program. The wetlands are kind of, they had a huge flooding event. So they're kind of being restored or just kind of, they've got some plans in the works for those wetlands. So no canoeing right now, but really cool photo and really awesome riverine wetlands if you ever get the chance to go there. And then obviously bird watching is a big one that we do in wetlands, and fishing where it's allowed. Super fun. Let's see, trying to switch slides here. There we go. Other fun things that you can do while you visit them. We've got hunting. Lots of people, that's, a big family event that they like to do together and spend time together. This is another picture from the Great Marsh at Fontenelle Forest, where I did a lot of summer camps, and this was like pure joy in a wetland, and I had to share it. So lots of good memories can be made. It's a great place for kids to explore. It holds such a biodiversity of life to see. And so then, doing studies and honestly just observing what you find while you're in wetlands. This is kind of ties in with what Ted said about, or someone had asked about, how can we contribute? And so there are programs like iNaturalist. If you have a smartphone, you can download the iNaturalist app, and it's fairly accurate in identifying things that you might find. And also it's really cool because you can be like your own community scientist and contribute observations. So say you saw a certain bird species, you logged it in to iNaturalist, that creates a collection of scientific data that can actually be used by scientists and biologists. So, and a similar one is also eBird, which is obviously specific to birds. But yeah, it's just a really cool thing. It's a really cool app if you ever get the chance. I've always believed that everyone can be and is a scientist, and you do science in your everyday life. So it's a cool way to kind of enjoy a wetland. So some of these places where to go, and Ted, feel free to jump in. I have kind of highlighted the main ones that he had in our wetlands project we're working on. Marsh Wren is the one you're talking about with the water restoration kind of process you've got going on. Yeah, okay.
Yes.
Yeah, so they've got a viewing platform there, a spotting scope, and a loop trail. There's the Lincoln Saline Wetlands Nature Center. Obviously, you can see the Lower Platte South Natural Resources District kind of helps facilitate a lot of these spaces, but there are definitely others, wildlife management areas. And with that, I also have, Ted, I don't know if you want to add anything here.
No, I think your next one shows kind of a list where people can go to get the directions, or the website at the City of Lincoln.
Yep.
If you type in Saline Wetland Conservation Partnership,
Mm-hmm.
They will give you this information on places to go where there's parking lots and things. So
yeah, I even just Googled saline wetlands, and it took me pretty easily to this map, which I think is really cool. And again, it's really useful to know ahead of time, do I have maybe a trail, a parking lot, where I'm going and what to expect. So this is a real map, and like Ted said, it's on that in the City of Lincoln's website.
I would check with the local regulations that some areas are open to hunting, some are not, some areas allow dogs and some do not. So just kind of understand or check with whoever's owning those areas what those rules might be. But they're all open to general hiking and birding and nature observation.
Yeah. So as you can see around Lincoln, I know this shows more north of Lincoln, especially, but there are a lot of places locally that you can go check out. So would definitely encourage that, especially as spring is on its way. I know it doesn't feel like it, but it will start to happen. Migration will start to happen, and it will be an exciting time to kind of get outside and see what's coming through. So with that, we have a last thing, a big project that Ted, I think I'll let you kind of give the overview because you're the one that got this project going.
Oh, okay, thanks, Grace. So
yeah,
so we're working on a project to update some of our education and outreach materials about wetlands statewide. What Grace shared with you were some places to visit saline wetland wise, but there's fantastic places throughout the state. I did see a chat question about, don't forget Heron Haven. That is a great wetland in the Omaha area. We just don't have time to get into all the areas all around the state. But this particular project we're going to have some printed materials, an updated guide to Nebraska wetlands that will have places to visit. And one of the really neat things is a Platte Basin time-lapse group with the amazing group of producers working with the Platte Basin time-lapse affiliated with the University of Lincoln, Nebraska-Lincoln. They're working on a project to produce audiovisual materials that just are outstanding.
Yeah. And the last slide was just a thank you and what questions do we have. So we'll, Olivia, I don't know if you want to read them to us.
Yeah,
or...
it looks like we have a couple in the Q&A. Nikki asked, do wetlands that get constructed on areas that they were before have better success? And how do we know where wetlands used to be?
Great question. Like I mentioned earlier, that wetlands, constructed where they historically were, are going to generally fare better. And the way we determine that is looking at the soils mapping. Soil scientists did an amazing job of mapping out the different soil types, and they have very unique characteristics where there's wetland. And then we also use historical knowledge, either from landowners, also historical records, old aerial photos, things like that can help us tell how a wetland where it might have been and functioned. Do you have anything to add to that, Grace?
Nope, I think you covered it.
Okay.
It looks like Stephen asked, what is being done to control red cedar trees at some of these sites?
Yeah, cedar is a problem in lots of places. It's a great tree in places. It's native and can provide some good wildlife habitat, but it also can become invasive and crowd out. It doesn't grow in wetlands per se. It doesn't like its feet really wet. It's wet, but it will grow in the uplands surrounding these wetlands that provide important habitat. So we are removing cedar from the uplands in places as we can. And again, can provide help to private landowners to do that as well on places. So.
Yeah, I know in the Niobrara area, there's a lot of prescribed fire being applied as well to try to manage cedar. So
yeah.
It looks like those are all the questions that were in. If anyone else who is still attending or logged into the Zoom, if you guys have any questions, feel free to drop them in our chat or Q&A. Oh, Philip asked, how does Lincoln produce saline wetlands and why are they not more abundant?
How do they produce? Well, I mean, we had the saline wetlands here, and the ones we still have are caused by this upwelling, this positive upward movement of salty groundwater. And they're never very abundant because they only occur in these stream valleys where that groundwater is under pressure and has the salts in it. So a very unique set of circumstances to cause that to happen. So we have lots of other kinds of wetlands all over the state, just to get this combination of the salts and the water in coming to the surface is unusual. And so that's what makes them unique to Lincoln. If that addressed the question, if not, ask
yeah,
It looks like Sonia asked, aside from the Nebraska Wetlands website, what resources would you recommend we check out to learn more?
You want to talk about some of the materials, maybe, Grace, that you have? Just, I mean, your division has a bunch of amazing materials for education in general and outdoor education. And
I might not have as much knowledge on which ones are wetland specific, but yeah, so I don't know. We've got Nebraska Land also articles, and that magazine does a really fantastic job of covering a wide variety of natural resources topics, but wetlands are usually within that, and that's a great way to learn. Within the education division, which is where I work in Game and Parks, I know we have a lot of publications that maybe focus not necessarily specifically on wetlands, but on bird species, depending on where you are in the state. I think we have different ones, and same with like reptiles as well as fish. So we have a lot of printed resources like that we can distribute.
Elise asked, what role do NRDs play in conservation efforts to conserve or reconstruct wetlands?
Yeah, again, Lower Platte South NRD, which is a local one around Lincoln, they've been an amazing partner. They've been very active in saline wetland conservation, from helping uh, uh, purchase some areas to doing conservation easements where landowners willing, to doing private lands work, to being one of the founding members of the Partnership for Saline Wetlands. The NRDs, there's 23 across the state. Uh, some are very involved with wetlands. We work closely with some Papio Missouri River NRD and a number of the NRDs out in the Rainwater Basin and throughout the state. So it just kind of varies depending on the resources in their given area, but they're an important partner that we work with.
It looks like Kim asked, are there other saline wetlands in other states?
Yes. Yeah, there are. Kansas has some. Quivira National Wildlife Refuge is a great example down in south central Kansas. There are some alkali wetlands up in the Dakotas, prairie potholes, that are kind of similar to our alkali wetlands we have in the western part of the Sandhills. You know, Grace mentioned that those unique alkali wetlands they're caused there by groundwater coming into them and evaporating away. So the water coming into them is not highly salty, but over thousands of years, it's carried dilute amounts of salt, and it just it evaporates and concentrates there, and that's what causes those to be alkali. So it's different. It's not saline groundwater coming into them like we have here in the east.
Darren asked, is the salt concentration increasing over time in the saline wetlands?
No, it would potentially, like on these alkali wetlands out in the sandhills I mentioned, there's no water that flows out of those, and so salt does slowly build up its level. In Lincoln, not only do we have maybe the groundwater getting cut off a little bit by this down cutting of the streams, but also water flows, fresh water. We get a big rain event, a flood, it washes through those wetlands and carries the salts away, carries them downstream. You know, the Lewis and Clark talked about the Salt River, you know, those salts were coming down Salt Creek even then. And so the salts slowly get exported away. And, but we anticipate that, you know, they can sustain themselves for thousands of years more if we don't mess the system up. But there's a lot of salts in the groundwater. It's just, can it get to the surface and cause these saline wetlands to be there?
Denise asked, what does the Salt Creek tiger beetle eat?
It's an aggressive predator and eats small insects, about anything smaller in itself that it can catch. That's called a tiger beetle. The tiger beetles are very aggressive predators, fast. If you ever try to catch one, good luck. I mean, they outrun you extremely fast. And their larvae, go ahead, Grace.
Oh, I was just going to say they're flashy usually too. They're cool colors that you want to catch it and you can't.
Yeah. And the larvae are actually predators as well. They have a 2-year larval cycle. So the larvae actually burrow down into the mud of the saline wetlands, not where it's ponded, but kind of that wet, salty soil area. And they can launch themselves, the larvae, I've seen some video of it, they launch themselves up out of the hole and can grab an insect walking by and pull it back into the burrow, or a small insect or crustacea or whatever that they might be unlucky enough to be walking by their burrow. So the larvae are an aggressive predator as well.
Melissa asked, are there any fish in the saline wetlands?
Not native really to saline wetlands. Some of the deeper saline wetlands, because they can flood from the nearby streams, will get fish in them, anything that's in that stream. The creeks, Rock Creek, Salt Creek, Little Salt Creek, do have fish and turtles in them. And I don't know, Grace, if you know anything about any of the fish in any of these around here. They're not trout.
Yeah, definitely not. No, I think that's definitely true. There's not many fish that would naturally be within those areas. But like you said, if it floods, they would go into those areas. But yeah, probably a lot smaller things, like when, you know, shorebirds are migrating through, they're eating much smaller things in the water than, you know, a substantial sized fish. So.
It looks like Eugenia was wondering what a good resource for geology of Nebraska would be.
Is the Geology of Nebraska publication I think the university puts out. I would check with, the state geologist is located at the university with the Conservation and Survey Division. And so I think if you just check out Conservation and Survey, I can't remember who the author is on that off the top of my head, but, and I don't know, Grace, do you know any?
You said, I don't, not off the top of my head.
I think Matt Chalkable might be the state geologist right now, but Conservation and Survey, you could check that out, and I think they would have, or your local library. And
The School of Natural Resources, I think, has some stuff as well online. So
It looks like those are, oh, there's one more. Should a person wear bug spray to visit a wetland?
good question, Denise. Yes. That is the one downside of wetlands, although it's not always bad. It's kind of weird how it just kind of depends on the right conditions coming together. Sometimes, I mean, in the summer, I would pretty much always plan on wearing bug spray, especially because it's not just mosquitoes. There can be things like ticks as well. So always a good idea to have it and put it on before you head outside. But yeah, mosquitoes are kind of a key part of the wetland ecosystem.
Yeah.
So.
And they can be very cyclic. You know, it surprises me in wetlands. At times I go to a wetland, even in the summer, and you have no mosquitoes bothering you. And other times they can be very bad. It just depends on the sequence of precipitation events and the type of mosquito that might be emerging at that point in time. But saline wetlands are notorious for having some pretty good mosquito populations. So yeah, it's not a place to visit on a calm evening in the summer without bug spray and some protection.
Yeah, and I find that if you go when it's the middle of the day, which is kind of hard on you, but if you go when the sun is beaming down and there's really no shade, but usually the mosquitoes are not as bad then, or like you said, when it's windier, better chance of enjoying your time in the wetlands a little more.
Yeah.
It looks like those are all of the questions. For anyone still left watching, thank you for attending. We're glad everyone was able to show up, I guess you could say. We hope you guys all learned something or found something else to do in Nebraska besides watch some football, maybe go out, hike in the wetlands, go bird watching or something. Just a reminder, we do have a small exit survey that will pop up once this presentation is over. That just helps us do better for future presentations, and it also serves as a way for us to enter all of our participants in a drawing for some free swag from either Conservation Nebraska or Game and Parks. So again, thank you everyone for attending, and thank you Grace and Ted for being willing to share your expertise with us tonight. It was really informational, entertaining.
Yeah, thanks for putting this on, and great questions. A lot of great questions and interest. It's nice to see that. So.
Yeah, thank you so much for hosting it for us.
Yeah, it was great to be able to put this on, especially on actual World Wetlands Day and Groundhog Day.
Yep.
Rest of your evening.
Bye.
Thank you.